Hello, ladies. I am Dr. Bridgette Peteet, and I will be talking to you today about safe spaces for women of color. I am a professor in the Department of Psychology at Loma Linda University, as well as a licensed clinical psychologist. As we get started, I just wanted to issue some acknowledgements to the RAD Lab, or the Resilience and Disparities Research Lab that I lead at Loma Linda, and my students who assisted with putting this presentation together, including Ebony Martin, Anna Espinoza, Laquera Pomogi, Shana Greenberg, Unique Tucker Cuevas, and Amanda Stoudemire Coaxum. So thank you to all these wonderful ladies who assisted in putting together today's presentation for this group. So as a scientist, I always have to give a little bit of data, a little bit of background to contextualize some of the information that I'm going to be talking about as far as solutions at the end of my presentation today. So I'll be just presenting a little bit of data. I won't bog you down too much and give you a lecture, but just a little bit of the context of, what we're talking about and how inclusion and exclusion impacts women in the workplace. So we know right now that women are more than half of the current workforce, so 57.4%. 1 in 4 leaders is a woman, but 1 in 20 is a woman of color. So we're going to be talking about specifically women of color in this context, just because we know there's a special case for the experiences that we face in the workplace. So while representation is modestly improving, the barriers to success continue to exist, particularly for those of us who have marginalized identity. We have much greater challenges. So if we look at the pipeline of inclusion, this is representation in corporate America. So I'm in academia, it looks a little different. I'm in psychology, women are taking over, but we were sort of thinking overall in broad context. So we wanted to look at what this representation looks like across gender and race as it relates to corporate America. So you can see the positions across the top ranging from entry level to C-suite or the corporate level. And then down the left side, you'll see white men, men of color, white women, and women of color. And as you can see, for white men, the representation grows from about 33% in entry-level positions up to 61% of representation at the C-suite level. You see patterns for Black men, men of color, where that pattern stays relatively stable, but lessens when you get to senior VP levels and as well as the corporate suite. And then for white women, their numbers stay in about the 20% range, 20 to 30% range across the board. However, for women of color, we start out at 19% in entry-level positions and go down to a mere 5% of representation when you get to the corporate level in the C-suite. So these are just facts about how we're underrepresented. The higher you go up, we're less represented. So this pipeline, while it's growing, we still have a long way to go and a lot of work to do. So what are the effects of inclusion and exclusion? So when we talk about exclusion, we know that the marginalization can be social. So we think about, the people who aren't invited out for coffee or not invited to the lunch meeting, not included when it comes time to doing social outings, whether or not you want to or not, sort of the principle of being included. And then experiencing those microaggressions. So microaggressions are those daily slights and verbal, behavioral, environmental slights, whether they're intentional or not, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative attitudes towards those of us who are a part of stigmatized or culturally marginalized groups. So I'm sure as I gave that definition, you can think of some examples. So judging our appearance, whether it be the daily critiques of our hair or changing appearance, tone policing about, everything perceiving to be said with an attitude or too loud or too boisterous, making assumptions about roles and credentials. So for example, I can think of, my old position where my office was located near the front door. Oftentimes delivery people would try to drop things off, assuming that I was the secretary and not that I was a professor in the department. So those would be examples of microaggressions. There's also this idea of presumed incompetence, where there's a perception that an individual's work is less superior or inferior because of their social affiliation. And that assumption is that they are placed in this position potentially because of affirmative action or hiring practices that are preferential. And with that, what that contributes is a psychological strain on those that are in marginalized groups. So we call stereotype threat. When you sort of run the risk of conforming to those negative stereotypes about the culture with which you belong. And it can create this burden, this high cognitive load. So all the stress that is piled on and dealing with these things and worrying about how you're acting and behaving and thinking and, how are people viewing this can reduce our academic focus. It can reduce our job performance. So all this can lead to underperformance. In addition to that, it impacts our ability to be recognized in the workplace and our opportunities to get support from managers and for career development opportunities. So it's really important that we address this exclusion issue. We know that those perceived and observed, so those ones that we think and those ones that we can actually measure, experiences of social marginalization are associated with impaired opportunities for advancement. So we saw that pipeline, factors like this actually influence that pipeline. So where 1 in 3 Black women leaders are denied or overlooked for opportunities. There's a sense of not having the psychological safety. So not feeling safe in the work environment, psychologically safe. So I can think about a job I had where I remember just having, my heart would start racing when I pulled into the garage in the morning. And I knew that wasn't healthy and I tried to avoid it, and so really, recognizing for me that something had to change, something had to give, and I actually ended up switching jobs. But that feeling of exclusion or ostracism, people not speaking to you, people not including you, people having the meeting before the meeting and not really looping you in on important things that are happening in the workplace. And all of that really contributes to burnout, anxiety, and depression, as I was describing earlier. So we understand mostly as women that it's important that we are advocates and endorse a work climate that is committed to DEI or diversity, equity, and inclusion. Some have named it JEDI, which I love, as justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. But we really understand the importance of that because of our own experiences. And what promoting inclusive workplace does is evidence has shown that it improves feelings of psychological safety. It reduces that interpersonal workplace conflict. Right? It reduces that cognitive load that we were talking about, where you can complete your work on time. You feel joy in doing the work and doing the things that you're passionate about. Reduces burnout. You're less likely to leave in climates that are inclusive. And then also feeling supported and increased satisfaction and happiness. So these are really important things that, make workplaces even more healthy that we need to think about as we're thinking about designing inclusive spaces. So a lot of times people think inclusivity means representation, like, oh, we'll just hire more of XYZ group. But that's maybe necessary, but not sufficient. That doesn't necessarily foster interpersonal connections. So where we're talking about having those experiences of having a person at work, having those informal sharing networks, having people who are rooting for you and mentoring you, when those opportunities don't exist, it still kind of contributes to that negative environment. So we're not talking about just inclusion. We want this to be a safe workplace. Women also at home and in the workplace experience a higher burden of what we call a mental workload. So it refers to the thinking, planning, scheduling, organizing of others, sort of the mothering, if you will, and emotional labor associated with the work. It's invisible, there are no boundaries, it's never ending, and it can take on many forms. So for example, being responsible for managing the emotions of other people, right? Taking on domestic duties like cleaning out the microwave, cleaning out the refrigerator, right? Organizing the birthdays, bringing in the cake for the birthdays. Those are the things that women in the workplace tend to take on over and above their required job responsibilities. And this disproportionately affects women and has a bearing on their physical, mental, and emotional well-being as well. So in safe spaces, the established support networks foster high quality relationships that can facilitate information sharing. So, as the office cooler gossip, right? Greater trust in the workplace, having a sense of belonging, positive emotional connections with other people, a sense of well-being, and again, the most important, enhanced commitment, productivity, and occupational success. So I just want you for a moment to think about unsafe spaces that you've been a part of and what made it feel unsafe. I gave the example of the space I was in that really was starting to, make me feel uncomfortable. Like I was having a physical reaction just driving to the building. And a lot of it was just unspoken hostility. I can remember sending an email once and thank you for that feedback. I think you left this one thing off of my, review. And I remember my chair at the time responding back and saying, you need to learn to stop being negative and just accept feedback. And I was like, I'm sorry. My email was so positive. I said, thank you for the positive feedback. Thank you for the positive review. But there was just something that he couldn't unsee in how I had sort of countered and, just acknowledged something factually that was left off of my review. And so I know for me, it was those kind of experiences that really made me feel unsafe, where people couldn't see me for what I was actually doing, but just sort of had some perception that, really clouded their judgment against me. So one thing about for you, what have been situations and spaces where you have felt unsafe, and maybe reflect on that for a moment? Maybe jot that down, because I'm going to go ahead and go through these slides since we're not live, and I want you to kind of get all the information. So I like this video that kind of talks about safe spaces and gives an example in a video. But it's really about being confident that you will not be exposed to discrimination, criticism, harassment, or any other physical harm. And what are those spaces? Let's watch a video.
Why should you use Miro? When you draw on a whiteboard, no one sees it. With Miro, you plan together in real time.
So the phrase safe space, probably have all heard it. I could say for me, safe space is used a lot in academia and on campuses. A lot of times when we talk about issues related to identity, diversity, equity, and inclusion, one of the first guidelines before a meeting will start or before a dialogue will start was, let's create a safe space. And I think it's important first for us to unpack sort of where this terminology comes from and how we might be using it differently than what it was intended to be used as. So according to what I've learned over time is that the phrase safe space was a lot of times used within women's movements, meaning a lot of people who identified as a woman or as women said, how do we create safe spaces? Meaning, how do we create spaces where we can speak our truths, where we feel like we're not being shut down, and really even just like physical safety. So a lot of times, safe space alluded to being in a space where you didn't feel like you would be physically hurt or harassed, especially because that was a common thing that happened to you if you were part of an identity group that has been historically and presently marginalized. What we now see is that the phrase safe space is being used to also talk about not being uncomfortable. And it's really important to recognize that when we're having difficult conversations, especially those conversations that are emotionally charged in the workplace, we can't necessarily guarantee safe space in that regards. So how I might react to a certain topic, or even me sharing my personal experiences, no one can really hold my emotions or guarantee that I will feel okay in terms of how I'm interpreting a certain situation. What can be guaranteed is safe spaces in that no one is harassed because of their identities. No one feels like they don't belong. So whether they're consciously or unconsciously being picked on, or whether there's some biases that are showing up, that's really what that term is alluding to. So what I like to say is, how do we create brave spaces? Meaning that if we're having conversations that are emotionally charged or that are connected to our identities, how do we create that space to say, okay, this is going to be hard and this is going to be uncomfortable, but we're not going to allow any hate speech or any type of language that will intentionally negatively impact someone, but we will make sure that we can create other guidelines to say, hey, you just said this and this is how it felt. And how do we create that dialogue in that brave space that we have? Hopefully that was helpful. And I'd love to hear more about how you all are defining safe space or brave space, or perhaps any other terminology or phrases that you're using while having some of these difficult conversations in the workplace.
Okay, so hopefully that gives you a better definition of what
$69 US Special Forces device turns men into beasts. This
technology, when it works, it works. I do apologize for that. Little. Oh, okay. So let's get back to it. All right, so inclusion, like the presenter was saying, it really is a place that everyone feels safe and respected and has a sense of belonging, where they can participate and achieve their potential. And we talked about diversity is great, but it's not sufficient. An institution can be diverse and not inclusive at the same time. And what we want is really a sustained practice of creating inclusive environments that are promoting success. So best practices in inclusion. So first, we want to set the tone. We want to understand why these safe spaces are needed. We want to make sure that we are making spaces that people really want and not just what we think are best for them. We want to establish effective communication channels and norms. So, whatever mechanisms are best in that context to create ways to share information. It should support personal and professional growth and learning. Be able to address and identify any implicit bias and those sort of underlying maybe subtle things that people are not aware of, but that they may have biases against other people. And we want to make sure that you're evaluating, what these needs are, because we can't sort of measure how well we're doing if we don't know where we started and we don't know if we're making progress. So it's important. Measurement is a really important piece of this as well. So there's a difference between reactive versus proactive spaces. Reactive is sort of what happened, I think, as an example, after George Floyd was murdered, where a lot of people wanted to respond to the crisis, to implement programs, to design all these things to address this specific issue, and to, recognizing that the climate has been problematic and that it's stressful, and, providing spaces for people to express how they're feeling. But what's even better is being proactive. So before there's an incident, these spaces are created in advance, where leaders anticipate the needs and challenges so that their teams are prepared to overcome them. So having these mechanisms in place before the crisis is really sort of the best practice. So for yourself, have you been a part of any safe spaces? And what about it made it feel safe? So I can say for me in my new home department, that my colleagues constantly check on me. How am I adapting to being in a new state? How's my family doing? They know my children's names. They inquire about our weekends. They check in on us. And that has definitely gone a long way to making me feel safe and included in my workplace. I'm not excluded from workplace events. I don't feel awkward when we have to go to, luncheons and things like that, because I know people are going to be inviting and inclusive and include me. So what about for you? What safe spaces have you been a part of? So fostering this community, it's important that we learn about the culture, interests, and lives of our colleagues. And I know some people hate small talk, and you may be more introvert. This may be a little bit more difficult for you. But really, the way that we foster a community is really learning about each other and learning about our experiences, our interests, and the things we like to do. It's also helpful to actually learn about topics related to diversity and inclusion. So there's an element of reading and preparing and studying and following people on social media and really enhancing what you may already know about diverse groups. We're never going to be able to know everything because our world is so diverse, but it's really beneficial, especially groups that you may be around and may encounter frequently, to ask questions, to do your own studies, to follow people that can help educate you on that particular culture. Everybody in an organization should be able to participate and contribute to the success of the organization. So it's really important that we are thinking about the need of a diverse workplace and not just the needs of a few. So this includes everyone. And not just when you think about culture, right? We also want to think about religious diversity. We also want to think about sexual orientation and those kinds of things, and how we can make those groups feel included in the workplace as well. Oftentimes, because race is so contentious, we focus on that first. And that's helpful because we do have a lot of racial tensions in this country. But we want to think about that bigger picture of diversity and being more conscious of other diversity and diversity-related issues that groups experience as far as marginalization. So inclusion and decision-making, making sure that there's diverse representation among the heavy hitters, the decision makers, the influencers in the workplace is an important way to build community. Being aware and conscious of those holidays, providing time off, understanding the significance of those holidays is really an important way to make people feel included. And this can include things like acknowledging special days, special months, celebrations, right? So here's a list of, a diversity of days that, you can be recognized in the workplace with a simple email, a simple, word, a note, things like that. It doesn't have to be over the top. It doesn't have to be costly, but it really can help people feel included and that their cultures that matter to them are acknowledged. And so, making sure you're not scheduling things that are on major holidays or, penalizing people for being out as they're celebrating those major cultural holidays. Safe spaces can be virtual. And this is something that my students help me with because I'm not great with social media. And there actually are some safe spaces that are online. So these online communities for women of color help you have spaces to process a lot of the mental load, those intentional spaces that promote success among women, whether it's self-care, mental wellness, family, confidence, that work-life balance stuff, and productivity. So there's some, just ideas of virtual safe spaces that my students I thought was really cool. In addition to that, we think about those maybe more traditional spaces. So women's groups, book clubs, dinner clubs, sororities, sports group, prayer groups, right? Like the women's conference that was held recently, music groups and other interest groups. There are a lot of resources online to find these groups, and you can meet in person and, do some of the things that you enjoy with other women, like-minded women. So it doesn't just have to be safe spaces in the workplace, but it is important to connect to other human beings. So as we close, I just wanted you to think about some discussion questions. What challenges have you faced over the course of your career? What lessons have you found to be helpful? What strategies have you used to address or cope with workplace exclusion? Have you talked with HR? Have you gone to therapy? Have you engaged in prayer? Have you sought counseling from a pastor? And what would you like to see your supervisor and colleagues do to further inclusion in your workplace? A lot of times people have no idea, and sometimes it's up to us to tell them what we need. And so make sure that you're vocal about that in your workplace. Apologize for the typo on this slide. I thought I caught them all, but I'm sure you will forgive me with grace. I thank you so much for your time and allowing me to spend a little bit of this time with you to share about creating safe spaces in the workplace. Please feel free to reach out with questions or comments. I would be happy to answer those. My email is bpeteet, so it's bpeteet @llu.edu. I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.